Hi, it's Frank. I'm once again talking about modulation. This time I'm talking about the other two kinds of modulations techniques that I alluded to in my previous video. In that one I mentioned common chord or pivot chord modulation, as it's also known. Today I was going to talk about the other two kinds, which are chromatic and direct. And traditionally those three encompass most of the kind of modulations we see in Western music. With regard to chromatic modulation, we get rid of the idea of having a native chord the way we did with a pivot chord. And we simply use a small chromatic run of notes to link the old key to the new key. You can see doing that means we no longer have to rely on the chord, a chord being the bridge. What it means is we can have a series of chords moving toward that new key. If we handle the movements of some or all of those voices, and seldom all, but most, let's say, then we can go ahead and make it sound very smooth, even when we're moving to a more exotic key than we might not necessarily expect. So this really becomes as much about the idea of voice leading and how you handle individual voices, whether you're arranging for guitar, piano, any number of instruments, or literal voices. How you handle that and you move those around is what determines how you get from the old key to the new key. This opens up some possibilities beyond any sort of pivot chord, obviously, because once again, when we talk about chromatic, you can use any series of notes depending on where you are at that moment and where you want to get to. With regard to a direct modulation, which is a really popular form of modulation in music even nowadays, the idea is you don't deal with anything involving a pivot chord, or for that matter even try and make anything smooth happen with regard to chromatic movement. Instead, what you do is just jump into the new key, quite often either at the tonic or via the subdominant. And the idea there is that energy level that you had was one place suddenly goes up as you begin to play something similar, meaning the melody you had in a new key that's been most often raised. So direct modulation is just that. There's no connective tissue, so to speak. There can be, but there doesn't have to be. And within the idea of direct modulation, there's two sort of, subgenres, which are categorized a little more lately than before, at least when I first learned about music theory. The idea is with a direct modulation, you can have what's called a step-up modulation, which means you are moving either by half step or whole step into the new key directly, most often at the end of a phrase, which again is anywhere from 4 to 8 measures, but it could also be at the end of a section, meaning like a verse or a chorus. But that movement happens immediately. And I'm going to list some examples of various kinds of modulation in the description of the video along with the PDF for this week, so you can always check that out for specific examples. But the idea is that immediacy of the move is what helps keep the energy high and actually adds to it as you move through the same melody that you just performed, but transposed anywhere from a half step to a whole step to any specific interval, depending on what the modulation was. Beyond that, the other kind of subgenre to direct modulation is sometimes referred to, I think, as truck driver modulation. That's the term I've heard. The idea there is that to set up the new key, in lieu of making something connective via chromaticism or pivot, you actually use the dominant chord of the new key. Meaning whatever chord your phrase from the old key is ending on, you immediately go to, at the beginning of the next phrase, the new dominant chord, and from there springboard into the tonic. The new tonic, to be clear. So the idea there is you've got a 5-1 motion, which is still the most dependable motion in Western music. That's what ears are trained to accept as now we're going somewhere, we're either resolving or moving somewhere. Sure enough, that's what this kind of 5-1 motion represents in a so-called truck driver modulation. Again, it's a form of direct movement because you're going directly into the new key, but it does include a preface, a brief one that relies on first hitting the dominant chord, the new dominant chord, before landing firmly on the new tonic. So this short version I have of Yankee Doodle is similar to the one I presented in my last video, in that the first 4 measures are the same harmonic structure, slightly different chord shapes. But the harmonic structure is the same, meaning we're confidently in the key of C. But then as we approach the next phrase, beginning in measure 4 into measure 5, out of these 8 measures total, we begin to see a modulation that occurs that involves not only chromatic movement, but also what could be described as direct modulation. So let me just get to that and play some of it to be clear. So again, the opening for this in the key of C has us playing with the C chord, moving to our 5 chord, to our 6 chord, and to a first inversion 5 chord, before once again moving to the 4 chord like I did in the previous video, introducing a secondary dominant, in this case by way of a G sharp diminished 7, which is meant to drive your ear by half step closer to A minor. But instead of playing it down here like I did in the other video, I actually play it up high. The reason for that has to do with an arranging choice to set up the next section. Because from this A minor chord, by the way, same chord, of course just using an inversion, I'm going to go to a E7 chord. Notice this chord's also spaced a little differently than usual instead of down here in first position. Because this is an E7, we know already right off the bat that it's not diatonic to this key. There is no E7 chord in C major. But what it does is help reinforce the idea that we might be returning to the A minor. The A minor chord we just heard twice in the first four measures. Recall that in the second measure I landed on it briefly when I did the and then now I'm coming back to the A minor, in this case here, on the beginning of the fourth measure, and on the second chord of that same measure, I'm here. The melody is also dropped down. The melody's there. It was the highest voice, now it's lower. But it's still present, of course. The main thing to notice, though, is that that A minor chord is being alluded to again. Because as I hit that E7, it would not be at all a surprise to have us suddenly find ourselves playing this melody in the key of A minor. It's a possibility, because I've set it up with a strong, well, first of all, with the use of A minor twice in four measures, but also a movement that involved both the G sharp diminished chord, which is, of course, a chord that's going to drive your ear, this chord, closer to the A minor chord, and coming to rest on what we call a half cadence, that E7 chord, at the end of the fourth measure. That's the end of that phrase, by the way, so that's why that's there, is to just make you think we're going to go somewhere new, and then likely it's going to be A minor. But that doesn't happen. Instead, what we do from there, when we land on that E7 chord, is move to the chord G, and then A minor, D as in dog 7, and then a D sharp diminished 7 chord, and then finally an E9 chord, and then A7, D7, G. So, safe to say by the time we get to the end of that second phrase, we have definitely confirmed we're in the key of G major. Why? Because right off the bat, at the beginning of the fifth measure, I use a G chord, and immediately following that I use a 2 chord, the A minor, going to the 5-7 in that key. Key of G major, as a reminder, means an A minor is the 2 chord, D7 is the 5, so 2-5. After that, I stick in there that D sharp diminished 7th chord, momentarily disrupting what would otherwise be a logical flow from 2-5 to 1, so that I can then come to an E9 chord. E9, as a reminder, is just an E7 chord with an extension added, in this case the note F sharp. But that chord happens to set up the A7 chord that follows it nicely, because I'm treating the E9 as a 5-7 of 2. I'm also landing on A7, which of course is not diatonic to the key of G either, as a result of that C sharp note. So that itself is a 5 of 5 in this case, before finally ending this measure. This is measure 7, with the D as in dog 7 chord, the diatonic 7th chord, meaning dominant 7th chord in the key of G. So really what I've done beginning in measure 7 and 8, just to round things out, is go 6, 2, 5, 1. Recall that with secondary dominance, the fact we're suddenly using dominant 7th or diminished 7th chords doesn't blur the root movement, and therefore the function of those chords. In the key of G major, E minor is our 6, A is our 2, D is our 5. So I'm still following that pattern, a very predictable pattern, I might add. But how I got to it beforehand is what made things a little more interesting, because again, I led up to that E9 chord with the diminished 7th chord to help slide into it. So there's stuff involving what we've talked about recently, but most importantly, what I want to summarize there is those last 4 measures confirm we are now in the key of G major. And at the point where that happened, between measures 4 and 5, there was a chromatic movement in notes that went from the A minor to the E7 to the G major. And that movement, to be clear, was A, G sharp, and then G natural. And I put it in the highest voice so it'd be very obvious. That chromatic movement is what helped us slide into that G chord, thereby establishing right off the bat the new key of G. Having said that, the fact that I went straight into G without prefacing it with any sort of pivot chord or a 5 chord before it, meaning there was no D7 just before I hit it, that could also be termed a direct modulation. Once again, measures 4 and 5 are A minor to E7 to G. chords. None of those chords necessarily connect directly to each other. In fact, that chromatic movement is why the chords connect at all, and that's why it's there. Just to highlight the fact that I wanted to make a smoother transition, while at the same time allowing for the fact that I'm now in a new key, and technically I'm hitting it all at once, meaning directly. All right, so once again, that's our time for this week. This PDF is available in the description. I'll also post some songs that feature some of the modulations I've talked about across this video and the previous one. I hope this has shined a light on how modulation works, and maybe you can get some use out of it in your own arrangements or creations. Take care.